A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 20, Confrontation and Contemplation. The fight on the train went better than Barry was expecting. The train got derailed, but no one was killed or even seriously injured. She was catching her breath when the biting cold returned. She still wasn't completely healed from earlier. She screamed as she rolled away from the cold. She landed on her back, looking up into the face of her now ex-boyfriend, Leonard Snart. He shot again, ice coating her waist and trapping her to the ground.
"Pretty fast, kid, but not fast enough." "Thank you,"
Len said, grinning. Barry gasped for air. It was so cold. "What?" she asked. Len smiled down at the girl in leather. She was very attractive. She filled out the suit nicely.
"You forced me to up my game. Not just with this gun, but with how I think about the job. It's been educational."
He didn't bring up that the heist had cost him a shot at happiness, had cost him Barry Allen. The streak, or whatever she chose to call herself, was only partially to blame for that. He'd known he would never be able to give up the game, even for her. Barry was amazing, but this game had kept him alive for years, had put his sister through college. He wasn't even really in it for the money anymore. He was in it for the thrill, and this woman was nothing if not a thrill. But she was also an obstacle. He leveled the cold gun at her face. Something whirred behind him. "Drop it!" A voice behind him called. Len turned his head, gun still trained on the woman in red. There were 3 people behind him. 2 he recognized from when he'd followed Barry to Star Labs, curious about who she was spending so much time with. Cisco Ramon was holding what appeared to be the barrel of a large gun that glowed similarly to his own. The body of the gun was massive, being supported by Dr. Caitlin Snow and a very pretty blonde he'd never seen before. "This is a prototype cold gun. 4 times the size, 4 times the power," Cisco stated. Len raised an eyebrow, turning back to the still immobile woman on the ground.
"I was wondering who you were talking to,"
Len said. Cisco sounded indignant as he spoke again. "Hey, unless you want to taste your own medicine, I'd back the hell up," he insisted. Len smiled.
"Your hands are shaking. You've never killed anyone before,"
Len pointed out. Cisco's grip on the gun tightened. "There's a first time for everything, Captain Cold," Cisco said, steadying the barrel against his shoulder. Len liked that. He'd always wanted a nickname. All the great thieves throughout history had one. Mick used to call him a dork for that. "I will shoot you." Cisco's voice only shook a little, though Len couldn't tell if it was fear at having to shoot someone or if he was bluffing. Len decided it wasn't worth the risk. Besides, if he let the woman in red live, he'd have a chance to up his game further.
"You win, kid."
He lifted his gun so it was resting against his shoulder instead of pointing at that pretty, if still masked, face.
"I'll see you around."
With that, he turned on his heel and began to walk away. Cisco tracked him with the barrel of the gun as he went. "Hey, leave the diamond," the engineer called. Len holstered his gun.
"Don't push your luck."
Cisco took a breath as Captain Cold vanished into the night. He set down the nozzle he'd been holding and grinned at Barry, his hands still shaking. "Couldn't shoot him even if I wanted to. This is actually the Star Labs vacuum cleaner, with a lot of LEDs. Cisco admitted. Barry let out a strangled laugh, shivering violently as Caitlin and Felicity raced over to her. "Let's get you warm," Caitlin said, using a piece of the vacuum to shatter the ice around Barry's middle. Barry reached out and caught Cisco's hand. She couldn't really smile right now, she was too cold, but she managed to stutter out a few words. "Thank you." She must have gotten more into those words than her half-frozen mind had thought she did, for Cisco's smile lit up his face like a Christmas tree. He grabbed a piece of metal off the fake gun and shattered the rest of the ice around her middle, careful not to hit her. Between the 3 of them, they bundled Barry into the waiting Star Labs van and sped back off to their safe haven. Much later that night, Dr. Wells sat at Barry's bedside. She was fast asleep, curled up under 7 blankets and 2 heating pads. Caitlin had insisted she stay overnight for observation, just to be sure there would be no lasting damage from the cold gun. Cisco's cold gun could prove to be quite the problem. He hadn't foreseen that to be an issue. Captain Cold. As silly as Cisco's nicknames seemed to everyone else, Dr. Wells found them quite helpful, though he hadn't originally known who'd given the Flash's villains their code names. He had suspected it had been Barry herself. She was well known for cracking jokes at the worst moments, if only to lighten the mood. Captain Cold was a bit of an enigma to him, though. He'd only met the man a few times during meetings of the rogues. He had once been the leader, but then he disappeared for a while, and his old partner, Mick Rory, Heatwave, had started saving the world with Team Flash and Team Arrow, though he tended to favor the Arrow's methods of getting things done. He and his associate, the Golden Glider, tended to team up with the Flash more often than not, but only against major world-ending kinds of threats. Then again, that could all change. The timeline had been damaged by him coming to the past. He had no idea how badly, only that his confrontation with the Flash under the red skies of 2024 Central City remained the same. The Justice League had still been founded, though the roster seemed to change nearly daily. Strangely, the founding seven rarely shifted. He'd given up checking that to keep his view of the future the same. He stuck to the newspaper headlines the day the Flash had vanished, the day he'd decided to make the journey back to the past. But Captain Cold was something of a constant in Barry's life. Or at least, he would be. Was supposed to be. Wells ran a hand through his hair. The future was getting more uncertain by the day, but he at least knew something about Leonard Snart. The tabloids in the future loved a good scandal. Some things even time couldn't change. One particularly memorable article had popped up sometime around 2019. It was a picture that no one was sure who had taken. It had been sent to the paper anonymously. It depicted the Flash, back pressed against the wall of an abandoned warehouse, a familiar figure in a deep blue parka between her legs, their lips locked together. The remains of a violent fight were scattered around them, a skirmish with an alien threat. Wells didn't remember which one, there had been too many. But he and a few of the other rogues had confronted Snart about the photo a few days after it had been published. He had simply smirked and kept on shining his cold gun. But Snart had gone missing mere hours after the Flash. Dr. Wells sighed. Everything with Barry was so complicated. She made it no less so by explaining that the man she'd been dating for the past month and a half was, in fact, the notorious criminal now known as Captain Cold. Maybe the tabloids had been onto something after all, but hopefully soon it wouldn't matter. The next day found Team Flash back in the cortex of Star Labs running more tests. Barry, who seemed to be fully recovered, smiled as Felicity came in, wheeling her bag. "You've got a fantastic team here, Barry. Speaking of teams, I should get back to mine," Felicity said, grinning at Barry. Dr. Wells smiled at her. "It was wonderful to meet you, Miss Smoke. Please extend a hello to the Arrow from us," he said, nodding to her. Felicity nodded. There were hugs all around, and she left. Barry made her excuses and left as well. Felicity yelped as Barry flashed into the empty train compartment, suddenly sitting in front of her, grinning. "Don't tell Oliver I yelped," Felicity demanded. Barry laughed. "Your secret's safe with me," Barry managed. Felicity smiled. "Speaking of secrets, you and Oliver," Felicity raised an eyebrow. Barry grimaced. "You know?" Barry asked. Felicity nodded. "He wasn't exactly subtle. He visited you a lot when you were in the coma, and then when you showed up in Starling, he was so happy. He's been moody for 2 weeks." She pointed out. Barry nodded. "He suggested we break it off. I agreed with his reasons. Doesn't mean I don't still care about him, but I'm not in a good place to be dating anyone. Not after this fiasco." Barry pointed out. Felicity, who hadn't been present when Barry explained about her and Len, raised an eyebrow. Barry sighed and explained. Felicity nodded, patting Barry on the knee. You aren't alone. Remind me to tell you about Huntress next time you're in town, Felicity said, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Barry smiled slightly. I just wanted to say thank you, Felicity. If you hadn't been there, I would have done something stupid, like hold a grudge against one of my only real friends. If you ever need me, I'll race over in a heartbeat. Barry promised. Felicity smiled. Same here. Well, as fast as I can, which could take a while, but I'll still be there. Oliver would too, you know. Just because he's got a martyr complex doesn't mean he doesn't care about you too. A lot. But don't tell him I told you, Felicity babbled. Barry grinned and hugged her. Be safe, Barry, Felicity said, squeezing her. Barry nodded. You too, Felicity. With that, she raced off, running back to Central City. It took Len a few days to track down his old partner, Mick Rory, but he managed it, found him hiding out in an old boarded-up motel, most of which had burned to the ground years ago. Slightly ironic that the police couldn't find the pyromaniac there, but he'd let it go. I know it's been a while since we pulled that job. I know it didn't go well for you. But if I want to keep running in Central City, I'm going to need a crew, Len said, pushing the metal box across the table to him and popping it open. Mick waved a lit match over the gun and grinned. I'm in.